want to thank you all for joining us. I want to thank the Education Committee who helped bring this programming to you. We're a fun group, so if you ever want to join the Education Committee, we meet the second Friday of every month at 11 o'clock at ABODE. So if you are so inclined, come and join us. Tonight, we're going to do our Death Around the World tour, and we're going to stop in Latin America, Mexico, and then we're also going to look at the indigenous peoples of this area. And we have two presenters tonight. And our first one is Lynn Blanco Perez. Lynn Perez, I've known her for a couple years. We've served on the board of ABODE together. She is the founder of Parting Planner, specializing in planning meaningful celebration of life and memorial events. She's completed the end-of-life doula training, and like I said, serves on the board of ABODE Contemplative Care, and is currently pursuing a mortuary science degree, which I think is wonderful. Lynn is dedicated to helping families navigate grief with intention, care, and connection. So that's what I have to say about Lynn, and I'm going to turn this over to Miss Lynn. We got to unmute.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Zoom is not my primary method of online meeting, so I always struggle when I'm on a Zoom call. Forgive me. Can y'all see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Let me just get myself situated here. Well, thank you so much, number one, for inviting me to do this. I'll preface by saying I am not the complete expert in this subject matter, but I have done a lot of research and studying, because of what I do. So I want to start by talking about something that we all experience. We don't always talk about it openly. Maybe a lot of people in this group do, but talk about death and the way that we grieve. More specifically, I want to talk about how death is understood in the Hispanic and Mexican culture and how that perspective shapes not only how people say goodbye, but how they stay connected. In a lot of spaces, especially here in the United States, grief is often seen as something private, something we're expected to move through and eventually move on from. But in many Mexican traditions, that belief is very different. Our relationship with the dead doesn't end, it just changes. So, with that shift in perspective, it can completely change how people experience loss, memory, and even love after somebody is gone. So today I'm going to walk us through that belief, where it comes from, how it shows up in tradition, and what it might offer us in how we think about grief. See here. Before I go any further, just a little bit about me and why this topic matters. I think Beverly hit all the high points, so probably don't need to do too much. Professionally, I work as a celebration of life planner where I support families as they navigate loss, and I create meaningful ways to honor their loved one. I've been doing this since 2020. It started off kind of slow, has picked up. I do have a full-time job, so I try not to go too much into it. And that's helpful for me because it doesn't ever feel like a job or like something that's too heavy for me or a big burden. So I really enjoy it. I also, as Bev mentioned, I am a certified end-of-life doula, I think cohort number 2 at ABODE, and I've served on the board for some time now. So a lot of the work I do sits in the intersection of grief, memory, and how we continue relationships after somebody passes. Through that work, I've seen how much culture shapes the way people experience loss and how powerful it can be when people are given permission to remember in ways that feel natural to them. So that's really what led me to explore Hispanic and Mexican perspectives on death a little bit more deeply. So before we get into the traditions themselves, I want to start with a question that kind of reframes how we usually think about grief. What if grief wasn't about letting go, but about staying connected? I think most of us are taught that grief is something we have to move on from, but what if that just wasn't the goal? So, to understand these traditions, it helps to first understand where they come from, because this perspective on death didn't just appear, it was built over time, over many, many years. Long before colonization, many indigenous cultures in Mexico believed that death wasn't a final destination, it was a transition. And I know that Jerry is going to get into more detail about indigenous culture, so I won't go too much into that. Um, Another part of the cultural foundation around the perspective around death is Catholic tradition. So, Catholic tradition is layered into this by reinforcing that the living can pray for the dead, we can speak to the dead, and we can honor them in meaningful ways. Some examples of that may be All Souls Day or belief that souls are still present in some form. In Mexican culture, family identity is everything. And that doesn't stop when somebody dies. They are still talked about, still included, still remembered in everyday life. Um, I have conversations with my loved ones often. So, some other ways that we keep our families as part of us. Maybe we cook a favorite meal. Maybe we say their name regularly, or we celebrate anniversaries. Birthdays, different things like that. And the relationship continues with our loved ones because the family connection doesn't end when death ends. And so that's really the core idea of everything else. It connects back to this, that the dead are still part of our family. So, one of the most recognized expressions of this belief is Dia de los Muertos, but it can often be misunderstood. So, I want to just go through some details of it. A common misunderstanding is that Dia de los Muertos is similar to Halloween because of the different imagery, the costumes, the decorations, but the intention behind it is very different. It's not about fear or costumes or entertainment, although there are elements, right, of costumes and entertainment in that. But the focus really is on reunion, remembrance, connection, and honoring your loved one. A lot of people see colors and they assume that maybe we're celebrating death. We're not really celebrating. It's more about welcoming loved ones back and the intentional way that we do it. So again, more about just maintaining that relationship with the person who's passed. It's also important to understand that Dia de los Muertos is not practiced the exact same way everywhere. There are regional differences across Mexico, variations in Mexican American communities, and of course, family traditions shape how it's done. I can tell you that I did not grow up celebrating or practicing Dia de los Muertos, but it is something that I'm very intentional about now and do every year. At its core, Dia de los Muertos is a time when families intentionally create space to reconnect and to honor the people they love. So I'm going to talk a little bit about elements of the ofrenda. At the center of Day of the Dead is something called an ofrenda or an altar. And this is where the idea of ongoing connection becomes very tangible. It's not meant for worship, it's meant for connection. And it's a space intentionally created to welcome somebody back, to honor them, to remember them, and to spend time with them. So I'll go over some of the elements of this ofrenda. I think all of these are in this picture. Of course, photos, right? Recognizing who we're connecting with. Marigolds, which are these orange flowers here, they're believed to guide the spirits back. Their color and their scent create a path to the altar. Candles. Candles represent light, hope, and direction. They help guide spirits and create a sense of warmth and presence. And they make the space feel alive. If you've ever seen a cemetery at night all lit up, especially during Dia de los Muertos, it's just beautiful. It doesn't feel, scary or dark. It's beautiful. Food and drink are one of the most meaningful parts of the altar. I think it's often favorite foods, favorite drinks. You'll see, I think over here there's like soda, but you'll see tequila, you'll see beer, you see all the things on the altar. The skulls, these here, it might seem a little bit surprising that there's skulls there, but it really is just they represent the acceptance of death and not the fear of it. These flags up here, papel picado, they're cut out banners. You can also see plastic ones, but usually paper, and they represent the fragility of life in the presence of wind and spirit. They also serve as a reminder of how temporary life is. So when you look at all these elements together, the ofrenda becomes more than an altar. It becomes a space of relationship. It's intentional, it's personal, and it's built with care. Not about loss, again, about that connection. This was just another beautiful ofrenda that I saw. And Abode we put together an ofrenda many years ago at the Muertos Fest celebration downtown, but I couldn't find a picture right offhand, so we'll have to send that later. Another element to our culture is cemetery gatherings. This is an important tradition that happens outside of the home in cemeteries. For many of us, visiting a cemetery is usually quiet, it's brief, often emotional in a very private way. But during Dia de los Muertos specifically, that experience can look completely different. Families gather at the cemetery, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight. They bring food, music, candles, flowers, and decorate graves and just spend time talking, remembering, laughing. It's a beautiful thing to see in the cemetery when families are just, connecting and remembering their loved ones. So beyond Dia de los Muertos, these beliefs show up immediately. These are some of the grief practices and beliefs that show up immediately after somebody dies. And in many Hispanic and Mexican traditions, there's a wake or a velorio. It can last for hours, it can last for days. It's held in a home or in a funeral space. Often you'll hear it referred to as a viewing. Really, there's no expectation of what's going to happen there. Often the body is present and people come and go continuously. And the idea is we don't want to separate from our loved ones so quickly. We want to hold on close to them just a little bit longer. And so modern day reality, all of these traditions are still very much alive today. They don't always look the same as they did historically, especially in the United States, because you see this blending of traditions. Families combine Mexican customs with American funeral practices. Now we have these public Dia de los Muertos events, festivals. You might see altars in schools or in cities. It becomes a mix of cultural identity and lived experience in the modern day. As Dia de los Muertos becomes more visible, there is a risk of it being misunderstood or reduced to just the visuals, right? There's skulls, face paint, decorations. Um, and so it's important really to remember the intention that's behind all of these things. The goal is just not to see these traditions, but to understand what they represent. So I want to bring you back to this moment. How would your relationship with grief change if connection didn't end? If remembering wasn't something that we tried to move past, but something we were allowed to continue, what would that look like in your life? What about these traditions show us that grief isn't about letting go? It's about learning to carry love in a different way. And so maybe the goal isn't to move on, but the goal is to stay connected. In my work, I've seen how powerful it is when we give families permission to grieve and but also to really stay connected with their loved one. And I think that that makes all the difference. And I just wanted to leave you with this thought. Love doesn't end when life does. Grief is something we carry with meaning, not something to fix. Um, So that's what I have. Thank you. If you want to talk about this subject further, or you ever just have questions about the parting planner and what I do, this is my information. Um, thank you so much for inviting me to share all of this with you. And that's what I got. I can't see my Zoom screen. Hold on.
All right. Thank you so much, Lynn. We have a few moments for questions. Um, why marigolds? What symbolism do marigolds have to the deceased? Because I remember I was in Mexico. I lived there in Mexico City for a bit, and down at Chapultepec Park, um, we went down there and not realizing it was Dia de los Muertos, and the marigolds on the side of the river and everywhere. I mean, it was crazy.
Yeah. Well, Jerry might have more of, I don't know if he's going to touch on that in his presentation, but I will say the color and there's a very significant scent, I think, to marigolds. And so you might have more about it, but that's to me, those are the primary reasons that those are chosen.
I'm not going to
Um,
touch on marigolds in my presentation, but I will just say so the flower
okay.
itself in Nahuatl is called cempasúchil, and basically the flower itself is believed to help guide the dead back to the world of the living. And so through both the color and the scent, so that's why it's used as a way to basically show, right, your ancestors and those that have passed how to arrive back at their home or the ofrenda.
Oh, that's lovely. I mentioned in the chat, I've driven by San Fernando Cemetery on Dia de los Muertos, and it was just so amazing to see the families that just camped out there. And there was even a family having a barbecue. They brought the grill, and
Yeah.
I just thought, wow.
Yeah, I was gonna touch on that. So, I talked primarily about Dia de los Muertos and how we gather in the cemetery at that time, but really, I think that that carries over into what we do on a normal, you know, anniversary of a death or so forth. I can tell you specifically, I lost one of my best friends some years back, and on her birthday, on the day that she passed, the anniversary day she passed, me and my girlfriends go. We have brunch or happy hour at her grave. We have music. We're laughing. And anytime I go to a cemetery, especially on the south side, I mean, there's people there. They're watering the grass. They have the music on. Um, it's just a lovely thing, and I think it comes from that, right? It comes from the way we celebrate on Dia de los Muertos, but also we celebrate them at all times.
Mhm. What's the difference between Dia de los Muertos and is it All Saints Day that happens the day after?
So All Saints Day, I believe, is more religious based,
Okay.
whereas Dia de los Muertos, it's based on that Mexican heritage, indigenous culture.
Okay. Does all of Latin America celebrate Dia de los Muertos?
I don't believe so. No, not all of Latin America. And then, like I mentioned, different parts of Mexico may celebrate it differently.
Mhm.
And really, I think it's important to understand the tradition, but you can do it differently. I have somewhat of an altar at all times for the people who've passed in my home. And come Dia de los Muertos, I bring in the fresh flowers, I light the candles. I do more. I put more of I don't think I touched on all of the elements of the altar, but water and salt and different elements that go. Those are all very intentional to bring your loved ones back.
It's such a lovely tradition,
Yes, it's beautiful.
and
I think it's
you
something I would
wonder.
really love to bring back to Abode too, and
Yeah,
be able to do this during Dia de los Muertos in San Antonio. Like, you know,
yeah,
bring that back, allow people to think of their own altar or create their own altar. I just think like it's such a thing for this culture here in San Antonio with all the mixes of population. Like,
hmm
imagine what we could share with each other.
Absolutely. And I think so many things in um, modern culture, right, have brought it to the forefront. Like we have Coco and the different movies out there.
Yeah.
There's another one, I can't think of what it's called, but the different cartoons that really teach children young, teach children to have this connection with the dead. And then Muerto Fest here in San Antonio, I want to say it's like the biggest, the biggest Dia de los Muertos celebration in the country. So I could be wrong. Don't quote me on that, but I think it is. It's pretty big.
What is the significance of the water and the salt on the ofrenda?
The water and the salt are for purification. So as the spirit is coming back to the altar, the salt is for purification and the water is for thirst, like to quench the thirst of the spirit returning.
So lovely. And, I
Yeah.
think this helps with grief. If you're not, it's not goodbye. It's like
Yeah.
fiction. Yeah.
Yeah, you always have that connection and you're, just holding on to your loved one. I mean, we want to hold on to them as long as we possibly can, right? And I think that this almost keeps their spirit around and um, makes it easier to talk about them. You never, as we're experiencing grief, you never want someone to feel like they can't say their loved one's name, they can't talk about them. Um, and so I think that Mexican culture really embraces that.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much,
Oh,
Lynn.
you're welcome.
Lovely.
Thank you. I stopped sharing already, right? Yes.
Okay. So we will move on to uh, Jerry. We saw Jerry last week, and I'll just introduce him again for those of you who were not here or who want a refresher. But I'll just say Jerry is our resident doula. He just graduated recently from our latest doula cohort. And again, just recently was awarded his PhD in cultural literacy and language with a focus on death studies and death literacy. He's been a teacher at SAISD, teaching Japanese and culture studies, and was teacher of the year for 5 years. So we got a treat tonight. He is known for the creation of SA Texas Queer Death Care Collective, a space for building death literacy, community support, and affirming conversations around dying, grief, and remembrance. So tonight, Jerry's going to take us to visit the Native American and Indigenous people and how they honor death. So take it away, Jerry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Tonight's presentation is called Honoring the Passage, Native American and Indigenous Teachings on Death, Dying, and Ritual, Rooted in Land, Guided by Ancestors, Carried by Community. And so today's presentation is going to focus on Native American and Indigenous practices related to death care, dying, burial, ritual, and community care. This topic requires deep respect because these traditions are not universal, and many practices are sacred, private, or specific to particular nations, families, or ceremonial leaders. You're going to see throughout the presentation that a lot of the information that I will present at first is very general information, right? Things that we know that sometimes spans across different tribes, spans across different Indigenous nations. But you'll also notice, right, that sometimes there is missing information, right? And because of things like colonization, because of things like missing records and things like that we're also going to talk about. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So let's start here. So a necessary starting point is that there is no single Native American death belief or Indigenous funeral tradition. The National Museum of the American Indian reminds educators to avoid generalizations and to use specific community-based language whenever possible. Different Indigenous cultures have different teachings, ceremonies, protocols, and beliefs around dying and the dead. So throughout this presentation, we should understand that these examples are culturally specific and not universal. Next slide, please. And so death care as relational care. Many Indigenous approaches to death care are deeply relational. Care is not only about the individual body, but about the person's relationships, their responsibilities, their family, their ancestors, the land that they belong to, and their spirit. In many communities, death care involves helping the person transition, supporting the family, and maintaining proper relationships with the dead. This differs from highly medicalized approaches that may isolate the dying inside hospitals or reduce death to paperwork and procedure. Next, please. And so dying, speech, and cultural protocol. One important lesson for culturally responsive death care is that not every person or family wants to talk about death in the same way. In some contexts, open discussion of dying may be helpful. In others, it may feel frightening, disrespectful, or spiritually dangerous. So, for example, in the case of the Navajo, right, also known as the Diné, a lot of Navajo individuals, peoples, found that having many direct conversations about like advanced care planning or just conversations around like possible negative outcomes to basically conflict with their values of how they saw death. And so for them, having these conversations almost seemed to invite a negative outcome, right, with the person's death, rather than, you know, maybe the way that we have started to see it, that, oh no, it prepares the person, it prepares the family. But in this case, right, those conversations are conversations that are heavily avoided. And so it's important, right, that this does not mean that we avoid care planning completely. It just means that we approach these conversations with humility, asking permission, and allowing the family to guide the language, the timing, and the conversation. Next slide, please. So family and community presence. In many Indigenous contexts, dying and death are not only individual experiences. Family, extended kin, elders, clan relations, and community may all hold important roles. This matters for death care because Western healthcare often assumes individual decision-making, while many Indigenous families may approach decisions relationally or collectively. And so in many Indigenous communities, right, people are playing specific roles and responsibilities, right? So it may come down to the children of the person that is dying, right, to be able to decide where the person will be buried. It may depend on the person, the spiritual person of the group to be able to bless the body, to cleanse the body. And that person may be the only one allowed to do that, right? And a lot of it is dependent on how they view the body and how they view the kind of transition of that person's spirit and whether or not it is safe for other people to be around during that moment. So culturally responsive care means making room for family presence, for community presence, asking who should be included, and respecting that the dying person may be held by a wider circle of care, right? And I think we definitely have started to approach this even in our care. You know, it's interesting because you'll start to notice that a lot of the things that we have started to really bring into death care, right, that we may see is kind of like a progressive move towards more culturally relevant death care, is really just kind of attaching us back to a lot of Indigenous ways, right? So it's almost like a process of decolonizing a lot of these Western ideas that have left the concept of death and dying kind of to the margins, right? In a way that, you know, we don't want to touch it, we don't want to see it. And we can see kind of the ramifications of that, right? Because we meet people every day, right, in our line of work that don't want to have this conversation or who are not ready for this conversation. And so part of it is because of those actions, right? Because we have isolated those experiences, we also isolate them in the way that we want to speak about them. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So spiritual leaders, ceremony, and traditional healing. For many Indigenous families, spiritual leaders, elders, medicine people, songs, prayers, or traditional medicines may be essential at the end of life. These practices should not be treated as symbolic extras. They may be central forms of care. At the same time, some ceremonies are private or restricted. Providers and doulas should not be asked to witness, record, or explain what is not offered to them. The ethical role is to support access, protect privacy, and honor the family's protocols. Right. So this, in a sense, is the reason why many very, very specifically cultural or spiritual or death practices for many Indigenous communities are not known exactly. Because, right, it's not a spectacle, right, to just to be viewed. It is only for very specific people that maintain that role of being the person that's going to help, this individual transition spiritually. And so a lot of what we know about it is either through somebody sharing that information or from just what we have been able to observe. But oftentimes, when these very spiritual leaders also pass themselves, that knowledge also gets lost, especially if someone else does not take up in that role. Next slide, please. And so care of the body after death. So care of the body after death can be spiritually significant. So according to many Indigenous resources, many American Indigenous tribes and nations have specific rituals and ceremonies concerning care of the body after death, often connected to helping the spirit cross safely. So this may include who has permission to touch the body, how the body is prepared, what items accompany the person, and how family members participate. And so one thing that I thought was very interesting, especially when it comes to some tribes, is the types of animals that are also sent with them, right? So in the Navajo tradition, right, a horse, a horse that was recently acquired by the person, may be the animal that is sent with them, so that animal can accompany them on their spiritual journey. So that does mean that the animal is also killed in the process, right, to be able to accompany them as they transition into the spiritual world. But what's also interesting is that the separation of that person from the other animals that they had must occur physically, right, in the space where they're preparing the body, because of the belief that this kind of spiritual event that is happening as the person is dying could potentially impact and have a negative outcome on those that are still living, or even the animals that are still living. So it's important, right, to ask about who has permission to move the body, to wash the body, to dress the body, or even just removing anything from the body. Next slide, please. So burial, land, and belonging. Burial is not only about disposition of remains. For many Indigenous peoples, land is what carries ancestral connection, spiritual connection, and relational meaning. So burial practices have varied widely across nations and regions, but the connection between the dead, land, ancestors, and community is deeply important. This is also why repatriation matters. Returning ancestors and funerary belongings is not simply the job of a museum or a legal issue. It is part of restoring dignity, relationship, and proper care for the dead. And so, right, a lot of times when we're talking about, issues and legacies of colonization, people have often thought about, well, where are these places, right, where Indigenous peoples were buried, right? Because of course they're not marked in the same way that we think about traditional cemeteries or graveyards. But the sad reality is that many of these burial grounds are actually underneath many places that we now consider either sacred or historical. So like, especially if we're talking about the context of San Antonio, I'm sure some of you have heard about Indigenous people from the area who have tried to fight for the removal and the kind of the transition of their loved ones and ancestors that are buried underneath the Alamo, right? And the fact that the Alamo still sits on, Indigenous burial ground. And many of those burial areas have been desecrated over time. Or even the San Antonio missions, right? Many of the missions were built on top of on top of indigenous ancestral land and burial land. And so this is another reason for why we don't really have information about particular either, rites of passage or death practices. And it's because they were not, just removed in terms of knowledge, but just physically removed, right? And kind of covered up by colonial knowledges. Okay, next slide, please. So NAGPRA and death care justice. So this is extremely important because this directly connects to Indigenous people here within the United States. A major part of Indigenous death care justice in the United States is NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Since 1990, federal law has provided for the protection and return of Native American human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. The Bureau of Indian Affairs describes NAGPRA as returning Native ancestors, funerary belongings, sacred objects, and cultural connections back to their descendants. This also occurs throughout all of North America. So I've seen this also happening within Canada. People, sadly, right, descendants of many Indigenous tribes that find the unmarked graves of many Indigenous children that were buried behind boarding schools. And so part of this, right, is to kind of recover those bodies and be able to actually kind of set them free, right, by giving them a proper burial in ancestral land rather than just be discarded right behind, like I said, many of these legacies of colonization. And so this matters because for many Indigenous communities, their ancestors were removed from graves and collected and studied and stored or displayed, right, without consent in universities, in museums. And for many people, for many Indigenous communities, they are still there. So repatriation is a form of care, repair, and respect. Next slide, please. So cultural safety in the end-of-life care. So culturally safe and end-of-life care requires humility. We should ask what matters, who should be present, what practices should be supported, and what should be avoided. Research on palliative care for American Indian and Alaskan Native peoples points to ongoing gaps in access and the need for culturally acceptable end-of-life care. Historical trauma, medical mistrust, rural access barriers, and under-resourced services all shape how families experience dying and care. Cultural safety means recognizing those histories while allowing the person and family to define what respectful care looks like. And I will mention this because I remember reading this article recently that I thought was incredible. So in the state of New Mexico, where there are several major Indigenous nations and reservations present, recently there was a push for kind of federal programs like Medicaid and Medicare to begin covering a lot of Indigenous practices, right? So rather than an individual having to resort to Western medicine, especially if they don't have any connection to it, now within the state of New Mexico, many Indigenous people can use right, their Medicaid or their Medicare to actually access traditional Indigenous ways of healing, which I think is incredible, right? Because then you have the ability to access these different forms of both healthcare and death care and not have to resort to a disconnected right way of being, right? I mean, I could think of like if we, right, if something that was traditional to us or something that we cared about was just suddenly ripped away from us, or we were having to, you know, complete a ceremony or bury one of our loved ones in a way that just was not in any way connected to us, right? How that would make us feel. So I think this is an incredible thing, right? That it's kind of going back to that idea of providing justice, especially to many of these tribes that have had to deal with histories of colonization. Okay, next slide, please. So as we're talking about just the local grounding, right? So San Antonio, so this is an important thing, right? Because San Antonio obviously sits on Indigenous land, specifically an area that was called Yanaguana. And so now it is, of course, known as San Antonio. And this is the ancestral homeland of the Payaya, or which belong to a larger group of indigenous people, the Cuauhtlictecan Nation. And so the city of San Antonio also notes that Cuauhtlictecan is an umbrella term that Spanish colonizers used for the many different ethnic groups that all resided within this area. And so for death care work here, cultural relevance should not be abstract. It should involve learning from local indigenous histories and when appropriate, building respectful relationships with local indigenous communities that are here in San Antonio. Okay, next group. Next slide, please. And so what this teaches death care workers. So for death care workers, this lesson is not to just copy indigenous practices or turn them into generic rituals. This lesson is to practice cultural humility. Ask what care means to this person and to this family. Make room for ceremony without taking ownership of it. Honor privacy, respect spiritual authority. Understand that death care is connected to land, ancestors, memory, family, and community. Indigenous death care teaches us and reminds us that dying is not only a biological event, it is a relational and sacred transition. And so what I did do is at the bottom of this slide here, there are several books. I've read, I think, about 3 of them. Some of them deal specifically with death, and others are just about this kind of relational care that happens in many indigenous communities. And so I wanted to provide them there. So if anybody does, right, want to know more about why is this a culturally significant event for many indigenous communities, right? What is this idea about this spiritual transition, and why is it that only certain people participate, right, versus the entire community? So yeah, I wanted to put those there because, like I said, I think these are incredible, just incredible works that can help, people understand many of these indigenous ways of practicing death care. Okay, next slide, please. And so the following examples, I wanted to now give you kind of specific examples of what happens in many indigenous communities, but they are meant to highlight the diversity of indigenous death care practices, not to define them completely. Each nation, community, and family may practice differently. Some knowledge is sacred and not meant for public sharing. The most important takeaway is not memorizing specific customs, but learning to approach death care with humility, respect, and a willingness to listen. Okay, next slide. And so the first group I want to talk about is the Diné, or the Navajo Nation. And so within Diné teachings, life is understood through the concept of Hojo, or meaning harmony, balance, and beauty. Death is not only a physical event, but a disruption of that balance and must be carefully restored. Some Diné individuals may avoid speaking directly about death, especially in ways that focus on negative outcomes, as language is understood to carry spiritual weight. After death, there are important beliefs about Chindi, which refers to a residual aspect of the spirit that may remain connected to the body. Because of this, there are often specific protocols around who handles the body, how quickly burial occurs, and how the home and space is treated afterward. Mourning may include avoiding the name or belongings of the deceased for a period of time. These practices reflect a deep commitment to restoring balance and protecting the living. And so the Chindi aspect, I actually had to look more into that because this is the first time of me hearing like exactly what this is. But it's not necessarily the spirit of the person. It is just kind of spiritual attachments that are kind of lingering after the person is moving on. And so a lot of these attachments are there because of the living, still holding on to the individual. And so, which is another reason why only specific people are handling the body and allowing that person to transition. So that there is kind of this clear physical kind of detachment from the person so that their spirit does have the ability to transition and is not being held back by anything, especially a lot of these very kind of heavy, emotions of grief and sadness and sorrow that can hold, right, the spirit of the person from being able to transition. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, and so the Lakota. So among Lakota communities, death is understood as a transition of the spirit into another realm. The process of dying and mourning is deeply communal, often involving extended family, elders, and spiritual leaders. Wakes may last several days and include prayer, song, storytelling, and collective presence. Sacred items may accompany the deceased, and ceremonies help guide the spirit on its journey. Mourning does not end with burial. It may continue through ongoing practices of remembrance, ceremony, and community care. These traditions emphasize that death is not an isolated event, but one that is held collectively by the people. And one of the images that I wanted to put here, actually two of them, and so these are from a recent event that happened a couple of years ago, when a pipeline was being built through the ancestral burial grounds of the Lakota people and the Sioux Nation people. And so that was a big deal, right? I mean, I think for a lot of people there was a huge disconnect between, oh, it's just land. Why can't we just build, these pipes through it? And so, I thought in that moment, like how disconnected we can be, right? As people, as other humans, to not have that same connection with another group's ancestral homeland or burial grounds. And the fact that we as a country, right, were willing to desecrate these burial grounds for profit, right, for business. And so those two images I think are extremely powerful because you can see how many people were there to protest, to protect, right, their ancestral burial grounds. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so the Hopi. And so in Hopi cosmology, life and death are part of an ongoing cycle that connects the physical world with the spiritual world. Death is not viewed as an end, but as a continuation of the spirit's journey. Burial practices may be simple and grounded in returning the body to the earth. What is most important is maintaining balance within the larger cosmic order. Ceremonial life continues beyond death, reinforcing relationships between the living, the dead, and the spiritual world. These teachings emphasize continuity rather than separation and connection rather than finality. Next slide, please. Okay, the Anishinaabe, or the Ojibwe. And so among many of these communities, it is believed that the spirit remains close for 4 days after death before continuing its journey. During this time, prayers, songs, and sometimes a sacred fire help guide the spirit and support its transition. Family and community presence is important, and mourning is held collectively. Offerings may be made to assist the spirit along its path. These practices reflect a deep understanding of death as a journey that requires care, attention, and spiritual support. Next slide, please. And so then the last example I'm going to give you is the Cuatlihuacan people, which is what the majority of the groups that you find here in South Texas and even into northern Mexico. And so today, many of the Tapilang Cuatlihuacan Nation represents many of these affiliated different tribal areas and descendants who continue to maintain cultural, historical, and ancestral ties to this land. While detailed documentation of pre-colonial death practices is limited, and this is due in large part to colonization, to missionization, and displacement, we do know that relationships to land, kinship, and ancestors have always been central. Death care in this region historically would have been shaped by mobility, environment, and community structure rather than fixed or uniform burial systems. The disruption of indigenous lifeways through Spanish missions and colonial violence significantly impacted traditional practices, including those related to death, burial, and mourning. Today, many descendants and community members engage in cultural revitalization, remembrance, and the honoring of ancestors as part of ongoing identity and healing. For those of us doing death care work in San Antonio, this means recognizing that we are on Indigenous land and approaching our work with respect for that ongoing presence. This also means understanding that culturally responsive care is not only about knowledge, but about the relationship, acknowledgement, and the humility that we have with those that we are working with. Next slide, please. And so in conclusion, Indigenous death care invites us to think beyond death as an isolated event. It asks us to consider death as a passage held by family, community, spirit, land, and ancestors. It also asks those of us in care roles to move with humility, to listen before assuming, to support before directing, and to honor what is sacred without trying to possess it. In culturally responsive death care, respect is not just what we say, it is how we make room for people and for their cultural beliefs, for families and communities to care for their dead in ways that preserve dignity, memory, belonging, and spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Wow. That was fabulous. I honor and respect that, where we live. We could live near a burial ground and not even know it, right? And that so many of these rituals and beliefs and things that their ancestors did have gotten lost, because of the colonization and the missions that came through. And but yeah, what a diverse group of people.
No, absolutely. And I think, one of the important things, right, is when as we're moving to try to create this more kind of harmonious, balanced, just kind of culturally relevant forms of death care, right? When we're thinking about these practices that we are kind of re-inviting back into the Western world, that we take a moment to understand, right, that these practices are not just what's a good word for me to use? They're not just superficial and performative actions, right? They have deep connections to community and to ancestral knowledge. Because I think a lot of times, right, we do meet a lot of people who put a lot of kind of performative action behind ceremony or ritual, right? Because, oh, let's just do that, right? Rather than really understanding what is the significance of this, right? How does this still hold people? How does this still bring community together? And I think about that every time that I, like when I cleanse the rooms at ABODE, right? Because a lot of it is this mixture of a lot of Hispanic beliefs that I've grown up with, a lot of Indigenous beliefs that I've grown up with. But I think about the fact of how many people were not allowed to continue that practice, right? Or have forgotten about how to continue these practices because of colonization, right? So I think it's important for us to just have those thoughts of how important this is to people, as we're re-inviting many of these practices back into our own death care.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think what I really loved from both presentations was how much you both spent time to talk about the non-sensationalism of it, and that it really came back to the culture and the family and the person. Because I think a lot of times those things that we don't understand, we either have a fear around or we sensationalize it, exoticize it. And so it's both Lynn and Jerry, I think you did an expert job at creating something that was meaningful and well-rounded, so we can truly understand instead of just, oh, wow, that's cool and beautiful. So thank you both for that that level of commitment and attention to that.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed
You're
it.
welcome.
And just looking at grief and how it could impact like some of the tribes where, touching and speaking of the dead is not okay, because it alters their transition, right? Where others is welcomed. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think especially when we're talking about groups and communities that have been so historically marginalized, it's important for us to also recognize community grief, right? And the fact that there are still many communities that are having to grieve over the loss of either ancestral land or burial lands or individuals that they can't even reclaim anymore, right? Or ancestors that are still locked up in museums or in universities. And so how do you even begin to grieve individuals when you can't even hold a proper burial ceremony for them?
It's incredible. Wow. All right. Well, I so thank you both for what you shared tonight, and it was spot on. It was exactly what we wanted to hear. And if there's no questions from the gallery here, we'll say good night, and we'll do this again in 1 week. And next week, it'll be me and Justin, and I will talk about Indonesia. And I believe Justin is going to talk about Muslim and Islam practices. So until next week.
Correct.
Have a wonderful week, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.